Global War 36 enthusiast here with a video about understanding the in-port mechanic. This is a redo of my first attempt on this video. I made a couple errors in there. Appreciate feedback from the viewers, and hopefully I will get those errors correct this time and sorted out. So let's just talk about why we have the import mechanic. Version 4 developed this new mechanic where ships can go in port. They can go into major naval facilities. Surface ships can go into major naval facilities and be designated as being in port. Subs can go into sub bases in port. But before this mechanic was developed, Italy was in a bad spot because if their ships were in Sea Zone M3 here, then typically once they entered the war, the British or maybe Americans would just pounce and kill the Italian Navy, and then the Italians really had no incentive to build any more naval units because they would just get eradicated right away. So it was an unfortunate situation and really made Italy stay out of the war a lot of times. You saw Italy as a Lend-lease power, basically. So this mechanic of being able to go in port was developed for version 4, and it really has made Italy a much more playable nation. They can get in the war, and then they can keep their navy as a fleet in being, but safe in particular land zones in port. So let's just talk about designating units as being in port. For surface ships, they can go in port at major naval facilities, shipyard, dockyard, or major port. These blue guys, and then you just put the little import designation next to them. And those ships there are actually in the land zone of Lazio. That's where they're in port. They're considered to be in that land zone. Submarines can go in port in sub bases. So you'd put them there, you get a little import marker, and then your subs would be in port here at this sub base that was cleverly built on the seam of M3 and M2 right there. Okay? When ships are in port, they can scramble out, similar to fighters scrambling from an air base. They can scramble out into adjacent sea zones. If there were a naval unit here, for example, and the Allies sent some ships into M3, then these subs could scramble and these heavy cruisers could scramble to M3. A new thing in version 4 is that if it's an amphibious assault, if some units came into this sea zone to perform an amphibious assault, then you're also allowed to scramble even if there isn't a defending unit present. So that's an interesting thing. The amphibiously assaulting units are so vulnerable they can be scrambled against even if you don't have a defending unit there. The limits to scrambling out of an in-port situation are you can scramble up to 3 ships or subs from a sub base or ships from an import facility. If you have radar, then similar to air bases, you have unlimited. You can scramble an unlimited number. So that's the designation for import. There's a couple of things that you need to know. Surface warships must be taken off escort duty. Refer to 9.4.5 if you're going to go import, and battlecruisers must be taken off rating designation. Refer to 9.4.4 to be designated as being import. If surface ships are built at major shipyards, like that major shipyard in Lazio, if the Italians built ships there, they could actually build them in port. But because submarines must be built at shipyards, there's no way that they can be designated as being in port because you can't go straight from a shipyard to a sub base. So subs are going to have to be built in adjacent sea zones. If you lend-lease units, like let's say that the Germans are going to lend-lease a destroyer to the Italians there in northern Italy, then as long as it's a major naval facility that's the receiving facility, then you could designate the lend-leased destroyer to be import there in northern Italy. Note that you don't lend-lease naval units by rail. It would have to be delivered by sea, so you'd need a path to get there. But it could be in port upon arrival there. Okay, let's talk about when the in-port designation happens. It happens at the end of non-combat movement. Even if you performed combat movement, this is a case where you can move during combat movement and then go import during non-combat movement. So for example, these subs could pop out here and during combat movement perform convoy raiding on the Mediterranean line here, and then at the end of the non-combat movement phase, they could go back in port here. So that's a devious little tactic that you can do. If you perform an amphibious assault, you can go in port in the if the area that you captured, for example, Malta would be a classic one. It has that major dockyard right there. So the Italians could declare war, they could amphibiously assault Malta, and then go in port there in Malta, the very same term that they assaulted. So what you can't do is attack two different places. Let's say that the Allies had held Tripoli, and the Germans used a naval transport here to drop one guy off and amphibiously assault Malta and another guy off and amphibiously assault Tripoli. That transport can't go in port in either one of those facilities because you're only allowed to go in port in the land zone that you amphibiously assaulted. It doesn't say either land zone you amphibiously assaulted. It says in the land zone you amphibiously assault. So if you decide to amphibiously assault two different land zones that are in the same, adjacent to the same sea zone, then you can't go in port at either one. So that's an important little wrinkle to be aware of. But it's a very common tactic to amphibiously assault a location that has a major naval facility and then go into port there at the end of the turn. Okay, so let's talk about getting out of port. So one thing to know is that, let's say that there's a submarine, an enemy submarine in a sea zone, you're in port and you want to leave. That's no problem. You essentially start your turn as far as movement costs as if you started in that sea zone, in the adjacent sea zone. So you just pop out. Submarines don't stop you from leaving port. Even two enemy surface ships do not stop you from moving out. But remember that once you have 3 enemy surface ships in an adjacent sea zone, that blockades a naval facility. So you don't have to designate it. I think in version 3 you had to designate your ships as being on blockade duty, so to speak. But you don't have to do that in version 3. Just their presence there automatically blockades adjacent naval facilities. So if there were, let's say this was a torpedo boat destroyer, now we have 3 enemy surface ships, then the Italians, if they wanted to leave, they would have to come out during combat movement or have other ships come from, say, northern Italy to fight those ships and knock their numbers down to 2 surface warships or less. Then, let's say other ships came, then during non-combat movement, these ships could move out. But if there are still 3 enemy surface ships, surface warships, then that blockades the naval facility and prevents the ships from moving. If this naval facility is damaged, then at the moment it's damaged, we'll talk about this in a little while, you can choose to have 3 ships leave, but if they didn't choose to leave when the major naval facility was damaged, then these ships are trapped. If there's damage to that major naval facility, they can't leave. If they do, if there's less than, if it's this situation, they're one sub and 2 enemy surface warships, then basically they can leave the port and they're sharing that sea zone per 0.3, which is the section on sharing a sea zone. Okay, let's talk about 3 ways to counter the import mechanic. The first way is a port attack. So a port attack is like Pearl Harbor, or what the British did here at Taranto. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that. But you send aircraft. There's 4 different kinds of aircraft that can participate in a port attack. Fighters, tactical bombers, medium bombers, and seaplanes. Note that seaplanes can only hit subs and naval transports. So the attacking player would bring in aircraft. They'd have to be able to reach the land zone. They don't attack from the adjacent sea zone. They actually have to fly to that land zone that the major naval facility's at. And then they get their full combat value for 1 round. They get to take shots at these units in port. Ships that are in port have a value in that situation of 0. Combat value is 0, so they don't get to fire at all. There is inherent AA. The naval facility gets 25% chance to shoot down each of those aircraft. It's not limited to just 3 shots. It's however many aircraft are coming in. And the defending player, if they have fighters that are in that land zone or are in an adjacent land zone at an air base, then they can fight with their full combat value. That's a port attack, and you basically defend yourself from a port attack with fighters. Another way to counter the import mechanic is strategic bombing. So medium bombers, strategic bombers, and heavy strategic bombers that can reach. Again, they have to reach the land zone to strategic bomb that naval facility, either a major naval facility or the sub base. And now they're not damaging the ships. Now they're going after the facility. So no matter what, they're gonna roll their damage, and then afterwards they'll face the inherent AA of the naval facility. And at that point in time, the defending player can decide to have up to 3 of their ships leave the damaged port and go into an adjacent sea zone. This isn't scrambling. They're basically fleeing the damaged naval facility. Any ships that don't leave when that naval facility is damaged are pinned there. And so I learned this lesson when I played my first version 4 game. I was Commonwealth, and I had a whole bunch of ships here in Gibraltar. Hambone was Germany, and he came in with a medium bomber and damaged that major dockyard. I could have 3 of my ships, and I think I had like 12 or 15 ships. 3 of them could leave. They came out here to A44. I then, on my turn, repaired the damage from the strategic bombing, and the next turn, Hambone came in again and bombed, and I had another 3 units leave. The best way to defend yourself from strategic bombing like that is to have fighters in the land zone where you might get bombed, and then they can intercept. Refer to the rules on strategic bombing for more on that. There's a third way that you can counter naval units being in port, and that is to conduct an attack on the land zone itself. Here in Lazio, where there's 2 heavy cruisers in port, there's no land units. If the Allies were to come in here and conduct an amphibious assault, for example, like let's say they came up the backside into the Adriatic Sea here and attacked Lazio from this side, then these ships can't scramble because it's not an adjacent sea zone, and you drop off some units to perform an amphibious assault on Lazio. Well, there's an interesting mechanic for naval units that are multi-stage. Any naval unit that takes 2 or more stages to complete, like heavy cruisers, any carrier, any type of battleship, they can contribute 1 militia for each of those multi-stage ships to any battle in the land zone that they're in. So even though there's no land units there in Lazio, if the Allies came with a couple Marines, then the Italian player could elect, they don't have to, but they can choose to have their militia participate in the land battle. Note that if any militia that are contributed by these multi-stage ships get destroyed, then for each of those destroyed militia, you have to choose ships that go onto skeleton crew status. So let's say that 2 militia were contributed and they fought off the 2 Marines. Both militia died, both Marines died. The Allies didn't manage to capture Lazio, but the 2 militia were killed. Then these 2 heavy cruisers would be placed on skeleton crew designation. And what that means is if there were another battle while they're still on skeleton crew status, then they can't contribute militia to that other battle. It also means that on the Italian turn, they can't do anything. Those heavy cruisers can't leave. They can't do anything on their turn except recrew. Basically, they're kind of healing. They're getting their crew back up to snuff. And so on the Italian turn, that's all they did. Their whole turn was go off skeleton crew status. That's how that would work. So there are multiple ways to kind of counter the import mechanic. I want to say one more thing, which is if the Allies did capture Lazio in our example earlier, then there's a 75% chance on a 1 to 9 that the ship in question is scuttled, and there's a 25% chance of any ship being captured and changing. Like if the Commonwealth attacked Lazio and they rolled a 10, 11, or 12, then that ship would become a British Great British heavy cruiser. You roll for that during the place units phase at the end of the turn. So there are many, many implications from the import mechanic. It's a great mechanic. It's totally revolutionized version 4. A fantastic addition, made Italy much more active in every game I played so far. There's a lot of cleverness to it. There are multiple different ways to try to counter it. So this is something that is a wonderful addition to version 4, and I encourage all players to focus on these rules before you play your first version 4 game, because it will really make a tremendous difference.